Have you ever felt like these disciples in the boat in this gospel we just read? Maybe experiencing great fear or threat in your life, or a sense that God is missing. We don't hear him, we don't see him. We feel alone. In the story, Jesus is in the boat, but he's asleep. Interestingly, he sleeps in the stern, which is the part of the boat that sinks first. And the words of the disciples to Jesus show that they felt alone. And they were questioning whether Jesus cared. Most of us, if we live long enough, have experienced all kinds of storms in our life. And maybe some of you right now are in the midst of a storm. Sometimes they're huge, and they turn our life upside down, and everything after is not the same as it was before. And it's hard. Sometimes they're not as huge. But every time we're in a storm, it's difficult. Situations come to mind, situations I've seen in others' lives that I've ministered to and been friends with, situations I've experienced. A woman is called by the police, a mom, and please rush to the hospital, rush to Kaiser Hospital, your son is there. That's all they told her. She races there. She gets to the front door. A police officer, or a chaplain, and the nurse is there, and they tell her that her precious son is dead. She collapses on the ground. A woman comes home, you know this story. She found a note. She loved her husband very much, and the note said, "It's over. He was leaving." A note. We all know the sufferings of widows and widowers. Their life partner is gone. Many of us have experiences of loss of health, or loss of a job, or relationship losses, even in families, divorce, financial losses, sufferings of all kinds. And in the face of such sufferings, like the woman I first mentioned, many of us metaphorically collapse. It's as if we're cut off at the knees, so to say. And usually we're consumed with despair, fear, very often anger, because we want to blame someone or something for this horrible thing that we did not deserve. Or we have a feeling of being abandoned, or sometimes ignored or harshly judged by even friends and family. And sometimes even God doesn't feel present to us. In this story, Jesus calms the storm. But the important thing that happens in this story is a dialogue of sorts. We don't hear all of it. Jesus invites the disciples. He listens to them. He says, "Tell me about your fear," so to say. But he invites them to a deeper faith. I don't think he's trying to shame them for bringing up the fear. But he's calling them to a faith that's more than, I believe in this and this and this. The doctrine, the dogma of the church is important. But Jesus is working with his disciples like he always never gives up on us, to become friends, to have a deep relationship of trust with him. So, wherefore he enters into this dialogue with them. The answers, there's really no reasons that we can come up with for suffering. You know, sometimes religious people can be very unhelpful. They come up with something to someone who's experiencing pain. Well, I recommend you don't try to come up with a reason, because you don't know. It's a to which we have a deeper, growing relationship of friendship with Jesus. And we can only get that in prayer, and certainly to be the Sunday Eucharist is important, but in our individual daily lives. And I'm not talking about saying prayers or doing devotions. Those are fine. I'm talking about the interior life Jesus, where he can reveal himself, is where we listen to him in our hearts, where we reflect on our lives. What's going on? Why am I in an argument with my husband or my wife? What are you asking of me, Jesus? All these kinds of dialogical prayer, discussions with him, and listening for that whispering voice. Where is he calling us? And then finally, telling him what's going on in our life. Even those difficult feelings, maybe our own failures, maybe our own regrets, maybe our own struggles. In other words, Jesus is inviting us to have a ground in our life of knowing absolutely his love and his presence, even if we don't always feel it. It reminds me of a story I want to share about a woman named Maria. My wife, Lori, Greg told me he never mentioned that Lori's your wife in the last Mass. I said, oh my God, they may think it's my girlfriend. Or she's both. But Lori and I worked on this retreat team. And in this talk, we were part of a priest, a brother, and her and I. It's like a Friday, Saturday, Sunday retreat. In the talk I gave, I sang the famous refrain. How many of you have seen Phantom of the Opera? The musical. I'm going to sing a little refrain that shows why I could never be a Broadway singer. But it goes like this. Masquerade, painted people on parade. Masquerade, hide your face so the world will never know you. So my talk was about encouraging the retreatants to not put on a mask with God. To tell everything you're dealing with. I'm struggling with this temptation. I'm struggling with this horrible death. I'm struggling with how could you let this happen to me? All those kinds of things. That our prayer becomes more real with God. It's kind of avoiding sharing difficult feelings of fear, anger, and loneliness. That's not what God wants. He wants us to be real. So Jesus actually gives us a great model for such prayer. Because such honest prayer, one example was when he was on the cross, and he screamed to the Father, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is the Lord Jesus. This was what he was feeling. This is what he shared with God. In my talk to these retreatants, I suggested if you have had a deep worry or anger or fear or despair or whatever in your heart, walk out there in these 40 acres of the retreat house and scream out to God if you need to. So Maria came to me we had time for individual conferences. She came to me, and I learned her story. She had lost her only child, her only son. Suddenly and unexpectedly and certainly unfairly. And she was furious with God. But she told me, because of her family training and because of her culture, she wasn't really allowed to let God have it in the way that she was feeling. Why? Because from her point of view, it would have been a sacrilege. So she did the next best thing. She slammed the door on God. For the last 11 years, she didn't go to Mass. I said, how did you end up here? She goes, my kids made me. So God can even use your children. So she told me she went out on the property and she took my suggestion, and she was real with God. And I asked her, Maria, how did it go? It's a true story. She said, Deacon, I really let loose. I gave God my pain, my anger. I screamed at God. And Maria, what happened? I said. She paused and she said, Deacon, in a quiet little voice in my heart, I heard God say, I love you, Maria. I've cried with you and for you. I understand. And then she said, I felt a little bit of peace that I had not felt in a long, long time. My brothers and sisters, this very gospel today was the same gospel 4 and 1/4 years ago that Pope Francis preached on a dark, it was a dusk, empty St. Peter's Square to the whole world. And it was during the pandemic. It was this gospel story of the boat. And in his homily, he reminded us, remember, we're in the boat with each other. We're there for each other. And he encouraged us then to trust that God is with us even if we don't feel him. Whatever storms have come into our life, or a storm that you're dealing with now, Jesus is reminding us that he is there. Even if he feels like he's asleep and not there, he's there with us. He accompanies us. My own life, I have experienced, and some sufferings take a long time. It's not a quick, easy fix. But I've experienced that his love will even carry us at times when we collapse. And that collapse can be physical, like the woman I shared with you, the mother. It can be emotional. It can be a spiritual collapse. He never gives up on walking with us. His great love will ultimately heal, I believe this, and defeat all the losses that we suffer. Even that